YouTube. Hi, my name is Mark, and this is Nixon Motorsports. This channel is all about motorsports, from racing to exotic cars and even simulators. So today's video, we're going to talk about engine refresh cycles for your motorcycle-powered race car. I think you'll find this of interest. With that, let's get into it. So in this video, we'll talk about how to measure time, mileage, and so on for your engine, when you need to determine a refresh is appropriate. So we'll get into that here in a minute, and then we'll talk about what is a good recommendation for refreshing. Of course, the engine builder will give you guidance and so on, and then we'll talk about how you can extend the life of your engine, or things you can consider on that front. All right? All right, so let's talk about how to measure hours and miles for your engine to determine when a refresh cycle is needed. First, let me start with this. Most engine builders, at least the one I use, likes to use hours on the engine. Well, from my mindset, and some of you may disagree with that, if an engine's running, that's one thing. But I care about if the engine is running on track, under load, wide open throttle. That's when I care about the engine itself and when it's running. So idle time, sitting in the garage, sitting in the pits, just warming up the engine, whatever that may be. Yes, it may be running, but to me that really is somewhat irrelevant from a time to determine when to refresh the engine. So I've always thought miles was a little more appropriate. Miles or distance typically will convey a sense of duration on the engine, because you'll be on track, you'll be pushing it. And so for me, miles was always an appropriate measure. Again, but most engine builders like hours. So some data loggers, I think most actually, have a hour meter in the logger itself. Now keep in mind, at least what I've seen on mine, while that will be recording time, it's somewhat irrelevant, because it's time based on the logger's powered up mode, as an example. So you would have to add some math channel around that to qualify that time itself. Okay, so let's talk about hours. And this is not extremely difficult, but let's talk about hours and the need for you to record and log time. And again, I recommend doing that separately. If you, again, create math channels for your logger, good for you. But what do you know? So you know how many laps you run, right? You know the typical or average lap time as well. So if you take lap time by the number of laps that you've ran, that's a pretty good measure on the amount of hours or minutes or time on the engine itself, right? Now you can do the same with distance or mileage, right? If you know the number of laps you've ran, and this is out lap, in lap, everything, right? And you know the distance of that particular circuit that you're running, it's an easy tabulation for miles on the engine as well. So those are the two areas that I would recommend, as far, or ways how I would recommend that you would actually record both hours and mileage. Okay, so that is the very basic aspect of recording time, right? To determine, I need to refresh the motor. So how much time, how many hours on a motorcycle engine do you need to plan for refresh? Well, my engine builder recommends between 15 to 20 hours. Now that may not apply to every engine. These are the Gen 5, Gen 6, high revving Kawasaki, the ZX-10R engines, just as reference. but 15 to 20 hours is somewhat of the number that that's recommended. Now the next question would be, well, how many refreshes can I do on a particular engine? That's a big it depends. My builder has commented that, you know, maybe you can get 5 to 6 refreshes, maybe. I personally don't do that. I at the most would go 2 refreshes and expire the motor and move on to another one. But, you know, that is a choice that you would have to make. So I've had a couple racers ask me this question, or people just getting into racing ask this question. Basically, you know, well, what if I just buy a brand new motor, you know, 0 mile, brand new motorcycle engine? I can just put that in my race car, right? I don't need to do a refresh or send it to the engine builder. You know, that basic question. While you can do that, I would strongly suggest you would want even a 0 mile brand new motor sent to your motor builder for a few different reasons. First of all, the builder can do, you know, basic inspection on the motor itself, but typically you would probably want to do a few things, possibly in high revving motorcycle engine cases, whether you replace your camshafts or not. You know, there are heavier duty valve springs that you could or probably should use to have a little extra safety factor for the high RPMs. You know, there's a handful of things that you could do, or the builder can do. But more importantly, even if the motor was virtually untouched for the most part, having that engine put on a dyno, having the engine builder ramp it up, basically prep the motor, you know, break-in period for the motor. So when you get it back, when you actually have it installed in your race car, it's ready to rock and roll. So I would strongly recommend that in all cases you do that, even with a 0 mile brand new motor. So next, let me talk about ways or things you can consider in trying to extend your engine life, if that's something of interest, right? Most racers want maximum performance. You're going to want to run the motor as hard as you can, and so on. And one thing you can do from that point of view is not be so concerned about the engine life. Maybe you want to throw new motors in the race car every race event, every other race event, and so on. Of course, that's an option for you. But if you want to think about extending the motor life and between, you know, extending that refresh cycle as well, here are some of the things that I would recommend. The first would be a very good oiling system. Dry sump oil system is the way to go. You could have oil starvation problems when you have such high lateral forces and braking forces in these type of race cars. So that's one. I would say a good dry sump oiling system is important. Now you want to make sure your coolers are sized right and working well. So oil, water, you want to make sure that not only are they cooling appropriately, you're in the oil side as an example, you want to make sure you get your oil temperatures and range where they need to be. Those are very important points. You know, I think about, well, here's another example. Closed loop fuel control, so closed loop lambda control. If you have that option, that's another great, not only for performance, but it's a dangerous thing to have an engine run lean, and open loop does have that possibility where you can have a lean running motor from time to time. So that's another area you want to look at. I'm pretty religious about this as well. Make sure you use a great high quality racing oil. Change your oil frequently. Don't skimp on that front. I change my oil in my race car. I change that every day at every track day, and I just do that religiously for that purpose. The last item that comes to mind is You could consider lowering your top RPMs just a touch. That gives you safety margin on top if there's an overshift. You know, these type of engines running in the 14,000 plus range, RPMs is definitely a contributor to engine life or lack of, right? So, you know, maybe you bring your shift points down to 300 RPM in that range. So those are all ideas that you could consider to try to extend your engine life, okay? All right, let's talk about what is recommended for a refresh. Again, this is an opinion. Talk to your engine builder. He's going to give you a lot more more specific recommendations, and every motor is going to have, I think, different needs, right? But just generally speaking, first, let's talk about a used engine. In other words, it's gone through the paces on track, it's got some miles on it. Or maybe this is a motor you picked up used, and it's the first refresh on that motor, same thing, right? First, number one, old bearings, rod, main bearings, I think that's a must. I would say a valve job, a very good valve job, new valve stem seals, oil seals, new valve springs. Virtually every time you have a refresh, you want to make sure you have brand new valve springs put in this. And just case in point, a lot of the Superbike 1K racers, they will change their valve springs every race, every time out on track, just to kind of put that in perspective. A higher mileage motor, I would say other things that come to mind would be piston rings is a good probability, you know, wrist pins, that type of thing. New rod bolts, rod bolt nuts, that type of thing are usually a very good thing to recommend. But those are just a few things that come to mind. Now, if it's a brand new engine, 0 mile, brand new engine, it's at the builder, look, you're going to want to have the dry sump system put in place. Now, you could do that after engine build, but typically you're going to want race cams or nice camshafts, you know, good heavy-duty valve springs. You're going to want heavy-duty clutch springs put in place, and those are just a few basic things, but hopefully that helps you from kind of typical what you would need to do on a refresh. Well, that's it for this video. Relatively short. Again, just trying to provide a little bit of insight, recommendations and details around refreshing your motorcycle-powered engine for your race car. And there's a lot of videos coming out here in the next few weeks, so stay tuned for that. Look, if you haven't subscribed, please consider doing so. Tell your friends and so on. I would appreciate that. But until next time, okay? Ciao.